For almost 2,000 years, the words at the center of Western religion have passed through layers of translation, tradition, and institutional control. Most people assume that process made the text clearer. But what if, in some cases, it made the text safer? Today, we are stepping into one of the most controversial arguments in biblical scholarship, the claim that certain ancient Greek passages were not simply translated, they were softened, cleaned up, and made acceptable. At the center of that argument is Dr. Ammon Hillman. Whether you think he is brilliant, reckless, or completely wrong, his core claim is impossible to ignore. He argues that when you strip away later assumptions and read the Greek more literally, the world behind the text starts to look stranger, harsher, and far less comfortable than the version most people know. This is where people usually split. Some hear that and instantly dismiss it as provocation. Others hear it and feel that shock of recognition, the sense that something old and buried may have been hiding in plain sight. And that is what makes this conversation dangerous. Not because everyone agrees with Hillman. They do not. It is dangerous because even asking the question forces you to confront how much power translation really has. A translation is never just a dictionary exercise. Translation decides tone. Translation decides emphasis. Translation decides whether a passage sounds mystical, medicinal, symbolic, literal, or obscene. And once one version becomes official, generations stop reading the original and start defending the inherited interpretation. So the question is not simply, is Ammon Hillman right? The deeper question is this: what happens when someone claims the original language says something the modern world does not want to hear? In this video, we are not doing hero worship. We are not doing easy debunking. And we are definitely not doing fake outrage for clicks. We are doing something much more uncomfortable. We are slowing down and looking directly at the claim. What exactly does Hillman say was changed? Why do his readings sound so extreme to modern ears? And if his interpretation is wrong, where exactly does it fail? In the language? In the context? Or in the fact that it collides with everything people were taught to expect from these texts? Because if even part of this argument holds up, then we are not talking about a minor footnote in academic history. We are talking about the possibility that some of the most influential words in civilization were filtered through centuries of moral editing. And once you see translation that way, the whole map changes. So before we look at the most explosive examples, we need to start with the real battlefield. Not theology, not culture war, not outrage. The battlefield is language itself. Because whoever controls the translation controls the reality people think they inherited. Hillman's argument begins with a simple premise, and a very dangerous one. He says the real fight is not over belief first. It is over vocabulary. Not what people wish the text meant, not what later institutions needed it to mean, but what the words actually carried in their original setting. That sounds straightforward, until you remember how unstable ancient language can be. A single word can carry ritual meaning, medical meaning, erotic meaning, social meaning, and symbolic meaning all at once. And once a translator chooses one lane, the others begin to disappear. That is the first thing to understand here. Translation does not only reveal meaning, it also removes possibilities. So when Hillman looks at Greek terms that most readers were taught to hear in a safe, spiritual, or abstract way, he asks a much more disruptive question. What if those words belonged to a harder world? A world of drugs, bodily practice, ritual contamination, status, pain, and altered states? What if the ancient audience would have heard something more concrete, more physical, and far less sanitized than the modern reader does. That is why his readings sound so shocking, not only because of what he says the text means, but because he is trying to restore meanings that polite translation often filters out before the average reader ever gets near them. And once that possibility is on the table, the entire atmosphere changes. Now the issue is no longer, do I like this interpretation? The issue becomes, on what grounds was the cleaner interpretation chosen in the first place? Was it chosen because the grammar demanded it? Because the historical context supported it? Or because later moral frameworks made the older possibilities intolerable? This is where the conversation stops being academic in the narrow sense. Because if translation has been shaped by comfort, taboo, or institutional self-protection, then the official version of the text may tell us as much about the later interpreters as it does about the ancient world itself. And that is the tension running underneath everything Hillman says. He is not merely proposing alternate definitions. He is accusing the tradition of selective hearing, of hearing what it could survive and muting what it could not. So before anyone accepts him or rejects him, we need to do the hard part. We need to look at the method. How does he choose between possible meanings? What evidence does he rely on? And where does interpretation end and overreach begin? Because that is where this stops being spectacle and becomes a real test of whether the text has been translated or domesticated. So let's move from the method to the kind of example that makes Hillman so polarizing. One of his recurring arguments is that modern readers have been trained to hear certain ancient words in a purely sacred register. We hear holiness, we hear doctrine, we hear symbolic language that floats above ordinary life. But Hillman keeps pulling those words back down to the ground, back to the body, back to material substances, back to the older world where religion, medicine, intoxication, ritual, and power were not neatly separated into different categories. And that is where the shock begins. Because once you read a passage through that older frame, the emotional color of the text changes. What once sounded clean can start to sound physical. What once sounded purely spiritual can start to sound procedural. What once sounded uplifting can begin to feel clinical, or even dangerous. That does not automatically make Hillman correct, but it does explain why his readings hit people so hard. He is asking the audience to imagine that the ancient listener may have heard something much more immediate than the modern translator allows. Think about what that means. A later reader opens the text and sees a familiar religious phrase. An ancient listener may have heard a reference to preparation, dosage, handling, contamination, altered sensation, or ritualized bodily experience. Same line, same language, completely different world. And if that is even partly true, then the distance between the original text and the modern reading is not small. It is enormous. This is why Hillman is so focused on the literal pressure of words. He wants to know how a term is used outside the verse that made it famous, how it appears in medical writing, how it appears in ritual contexts, how it appears in comedy, insult, law, and everyday description. Because if a word carries rougher meanings everywhere else, then suddenly the polished translation inside the sacred text starts to look less like clarity and more like selection. That is the accusation. Not that translators were stupid, not that every tradition acted in bad faith, but that over centuries, interpretation moved toward what communities could preserve, preach, and live with. And once that happens, difficult meanings do not always disappear by force. Sometimes they disappear by refinement, by commentary, by preference, by the quiet power of deciding that one sense is noble and another sense is embarrassing. So when Hillman reads a controversial passage and says, in effect, "No, this word is rougher than you think, stranger than you think, more bodily than you think," he is not just offering a translation note. He is trying to reopen a door that later readers may have spent centuries keeping shut. Now, to be fair, this is exactly where critics push back. They argue that language is never that simple, that context limits what a word can mean, that not every possible definition belongs in every verse. And they are right to say that. A dictionary does not prove an interpretation. A lexicon is not a verdict. Meaning depends on grammar, context, tone, parallel usage, and genre. So the serious question is not, can this word mean something shocking somewhere? The serious question is, does it mean that here? That is the real standard. And it is the standard Hillman's strongest defenders and strongest critics are both fighting over. So as we move into the actual passages, keep one thing in mind. This debate is not really about whether a reading feels offensive. That is irrelevant. The real issue is whether the safer reading became standard because it was more accurate or because it was more survivable. And those are not the same thing. Because if survivability shaped the translation, then what we inherited may not be the clearest version of the text. It may be the least explosive one. So let's start with one of the cleaner entry points into this whole debate. Not the wildest claim, not the most inflammatory passage, just a word family that almost everyone thinks they already understand. The Greek verb is chrio, and from that same family comes Christos. In the standard religious reading, this feels familiar right away. To anoint, the anointed one, a sacred title, a holy designation, a spiritual role. And for most people, that is where the meaning stops. But Hillman presses on the word harder than that. He asks what happens if we hear it not first through later theology, but through older Greek usage, not through stained glass, not through sermons, through the rougher texture of language itself. Because in ordinary Greek, words in this family can carry the sense of smearing, rubbing, or applying a substance. And once you hear that material layer, the atmosphere shifts. Now the word is no longer floating above the body, it is touching the body. It is doing something to the body. It suggests contact, application, preparation, a physical act. This is exactly where Hillman starts pushing toward his larger thesis. He argues that later religious translation trains people to hear only the elevated sense, consecration, holiness, divine appointment, while muting the older, more concrete force of the word. And if that older force matters more than tradition admits, then the text may be carrying traces of medicine, treatment, compound substances, or ritual application that modern readers no longer hear at all. Now, to be fair, This is also where critics immediately push back, and they should, because a word having a broader range does not prove that every use is secretly pharmaceutical. That would be sloppy. A term can mean smear, rub, or anoint, and still function in a religious register in a specific passage. That is completely normal language. So the serious issue is not whether Hillman found a more physical sense somewhere in the lexicon. The serious issue is whether that physical sense is doing the real work in the passage he is talking about. That is a much harder standard. And it matters, because if the context truly supports the ordinary sacred reading, then Hillman is forcing the text. But if the context leaves room for something more bodily, more procedural, more material, then the safer translation starts to look less inevitable than people assume. And this is why the debate gets so intense so quickly. Because once the audience hears that word family differently, even for a moment, the whole symbolic world begins to wobble. What felt purely theological now has texture, weight, substance. It feels handled, prepared, applied. And that is a very different mental picture from the one most modern believers inherited. So this first example matters, not because it settles the argument, but because it reveals the mechanism. Hillman's method works by taking a word that tradition has lifted into abstraction and dragging it back into contact with the body, back into matter, back into usage, back into the older world where language had not yet been cleaned into doctrine. And once that happens, the audience is forced to ask a brutal question. Did later translation clarify the text? Or did it protect readers from what the text sounded like before it became safe? This is the point where a serious critic would stop us and say, slow down. A word is not a verdict. A lexicon is not an argument. And a shocking possible meaning is not the same thing as the right meaning in a specific line. That objection matters. In fact, it is the strongest objection Hillman faces. Because language is full of words with wide ranges, some words can sound sacred in one context, ordinary in another, vulgar in another, and technical somewhere else entirely. That is not unusual. That is how language works. So, critics argue that Hillman sometimes moves too quickly from possibility to certainty, too quickly from an available meaning to the intended meaning, too quickly from a provocative lexical range to a full reconstruction of what the passage must be saying. And if that leap is too large, then the whole reading can start to feel less like translation and more like selection driven by shock value. That is the danger. Not that ancient language was simple, but that it was complicated enough to tempt overreach. This is why context is everything. Not just dictionary context, textual context, historical context, genre, parallel usage, grammar, what comes before the line, what comes after it, what kind of document this is, what kind of audience it assumed, what other writers from the same world did with the same term. Because without that larger frame, anyone can make an old word sound explosive. And once people are emotionally hooked by the explosive version, it becomes very hard to return to the slower question, does the passage actually support it? That is where the debate becomes real. Hillman's defenders say mainstream translators often hide behind tradition and refuse to follow uncomfortable evidence. His critics say Hillman often follows discomfort so aggressively that he mistakes the most disruptive reading for the most authentic one. Those are two very different accusations. One says the tradition made the text too safe. The other says Hillman makes it too extreme. And if we are being honest, both dangers are real. A tradition can smooth a text. An iconoclast can distort a text. Institutions can protect inherited meanings. Rebels can overcorrect and force meanings that the passage cannot bear. That is why this debate cannot be settled by tone, not by outrage, not by scandal, not by who sounds braver. It has to be settled, line by line, by asking the hardest possible question. What can this word mean here? And what can it not mean here? That standard protects us from two equal mistakes. The first mistake is blind trust, assuming the traditional translation must be right because it is familiar. The second mistake is seduction by novelty, assuming the most destabilizing reading must be right because it feels bold. Neither one is scholarship. One is obedience. The other is appetite. And both can fail the text. So as we move forward, the goal is not to crown a hero. It is not to prove that the institutions lied. It is not to prove that Hillman cracked a hidden code. The goal is much narrower and much harder. To see whether the safer reading earned its place, or whether it was simply repeated until it felt natural. Because repetition can look a lot like truth from a distance. And when a community repeats a translation for centuries, people stop hearing it as an interpretation. They hear it as reality itself. That is how inherited language becomes invisible. Not because nobody questioned it, but because eventually, questioning it starts to feel unthinkable. So this is where we need discipline. Every time Hillman opens a radical possibility, we ask, is the grammar carrying that weight? Is the surrounding passage carrying that weight? Is the broader Greek world carrying that weight? Or are we being pulled by the thrill of hearing something forbidden? Because the forbidden reading is not automatically the true reading. Sometimes it is exactly the reading the text can support. And sometimes it is only the reading modern audiences find irresistible because it feels like revelation. That is the knife edge. And if this video is going to be worth anything, that is the edge we stay on. No protection, no surrender, no cheap certainty. Just the text and the pressure we put on it. If you want to see why this debate gets volatile so fast, there is one Greek word family you almost have to confront: Pharmakeia. Most modern readers encounter it in translation as sorcery, witchcraft, or magical arts. That is the safe, familiar lane. And to be clear, that lane is not invented out of nowhere. In the New Testament, the word is often rendered that way for a reason. In Galatians, chapter 5, verse 20, it appears in a list of destructive acts of the flesh. In Revelation, chapter 18, verse 23, Babylon is condemned because the nations were deceived by her Pharmakeia. So, yes, the traditional translation has real grounding. But this is exactly the kind of word Hillman refuses to leave in a purely religious fog. Because the same word family is also tied to drugs, potions, compounds, mixtures, and administered substances. That is where the modern English word pharmacy ultimately comes from. And once that older material layer comes back into view, the atmosphere changes immediately. Now, the word does not sound like abstract evil floating in the air. It sounds handled, prepared, mixed, given, taken. It sounds like a world in which chemistry, ritual, medicine, poison, intoxication, and spiritual danger were not sealed off from one another the way they are in modern thought. This is where Hillman sees an opening. He argues that when later translators choose words like sorcery, modern readers imagine something theatrical. Spells, occult gestures, fantasy imagery, a category safely pushed away from ordinary life. But if the older world heard something closer to potions, intoxicants, administered substances, and manipulation through compounds, then the line becomes less theatrical and much more concrete, much closer to the body, much closer to power, much closer to control. And that shift matters, because a passage about sorcery can feel morally distant. A passage about substances used to alter, deceive, sedate, manipulate, or dominate people feels much more immediate, much more modern, much more dangerous. That is why this word family attracts so much attention. Not because Hillman discovered that it has a lexical link to drugs. That is not hidden. The real fight is over emphasis. When the text uses this family, should the translation foreground magic? Or should it foreground the older world of potions, compounds, and administered materials that may have stood behind the term? And once again, critics have a serious answer. They argue that etymology is not destiny. Just because a word family has older ties to drugs or mixtures does not mean every New Testament use should be translated as medicine, poisoning, or pharmacology. That would flatten context. It would ignore how words specialize over time. It would pretend that every root meaning is still fully alive in every later usage. And that is not how language works. A word can come from one world and function mainly in another. That happens all the time. So the honest version of the argument has to hold both facts at once. Yes, Pharmakeia belongs to a word family tied to drugs, potions, and administered substances. And yes, in the New Testament context, many translators understand it primarily as sorcery or magical practice. The real dispute is over how much of that older material world is still present when the word appears in these passages. A trace? A background echo? A central force? That is the fault line. Hillman wants the audience to feel that older force again. He wants the word to recover its chemical, bodily, and manipulative edge. His critics say he pushes that edge too far and risks turning a term for sorcery into a modern obsession with pharmaceuticals. But even if you reject Hillman's strongest leap, the example still does important work, because it exposes how translation frames imagination. If you read sorcery, you picture one world. If you hear Pharmakeia as carrying the shadow of potions, compounds, and administered substances, you picture another. And once the mental picture changes, the moral and historical texture of the passage changes with it. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between symbolic evil and embodied technique, between vague darkness and a system of influence that touches the body directly. And that is why this word keeps surviving every argument around it. Because even when scholars disagree about how much weight it can bear in a specific verse, almost nobody denies that the word family itself lives near a dangerous borderland. Medicine, poison, ritual, manipulation, relief, control. The categories are close enough to touch. So this example does not prove Hillman right, but it does prove something else. It proves that some biblical words arrive in English already interpreted, already nar. So why does any of this matter now? Why are people suddenly listening to a debate about ancient Greek words as if it has something to do with the modern world? Because it does. Not only in a religious sense, not only in an academic sense, in a psychological sense, in a political sense, in a cultural sense. Because translation is never just about the past. Translation decides what the past is allowed to sound like in the present. Most people will never read these texts in Greek. They will never sit with the ambiguity of the original. They will never feel the instability of a word that can lean in more than one direction. They inherit a finished sentence, a settled phrase, a version that already sounds natural. And once that version is repeated enough times, people stop hearing it as a translation. They hear it as reality. That is the real power of inherited language. Not that it argues, that it disappears. It becomes invisible. It becomes common sense. It becomes the thing nobody notices because everybody started from it. And that is why this debate reaches far beyond religion, because the same mechanism exists everywhere, in law, in media, in medicine, in politics, in history. A complex thing is translated for the public, then simplified, then moralized, then repeated. And after enough repetition, the simplified version becomes more real than the thing it came from. That is why a figure like Hillman gets attention, even from people who do not fully trust him. He is speaking into a cultural mood that already exists, a mood of suspicion, a mood of exhaustion, a mood in which people increasingly feel that official language has been cleaned, managed, and emotionally pre-processed before it reaches them. That feeling may be justified sometimes. It may be exaggerated sometimes. But it is real. And because it is real, any scholar, critic, or provocateur who says, "The original text is rougher than they told you," will immediately find an audience. Not because everyone became a philologist overnight, but because millions of people already suspect that reality arrives edited, that institutions do not only explain the world, they filter it, package it, stabilize it, make it survivable. And when a translation does that too well, people begin to wonder what got removed in the process. Not only what was added, what was taken away. That is the deeper reason this argument matters. Hillman's appeal is not just lexical, it is existential. He offers a possibility that many people are already primed to believe, that beneath the official wording there is a harsher layer of reality, and that the public version was designed to make that layer easier to live with. Now, again, that instinct can go wrong. Suspicion is not proof. Distrust is not scholarship. A person can become so hungry for the hidden meaning that they start mistaking the most extreme meaning for the true one. That happens. It happens all the time. But the opposite error happens too. People become so attached to the inherited wording that they stop questioning the decisions built into it. They assume clarity where there may only be familiarity. They assume truth where there may only be repetition. And that is why this debate has such force right now. Because modern audiences are torn between two fears: the fear of being deceived by institutions and the fear of being manipulated by contrarians who sell revelation. That is the tension. And it is exactly where this conversation lives, between obedience and appetite, between trust and paranoia, between the comfort of inherited language and the thrill of tearing it apart. So the real challenge is not simply to become more suspicious, it is to become more precise, more disciplined. more aware of how language shapes what feels obvious. Because once you see how much power sits inside a single translated word, you start noticing the same pattern everywhere. Who chose this phrase? What alternatives were left out? What emotional reaction does this wording produce? What world does it make easier to imagine? And what world does it quietly push out of view? That is not conspiracy thinking. That is linguistic self-defense. And maybe that is the strongest reason to care about this whole argument, whether Hillman is right in full, in part, or not at all. He forces the audience to confront a truth that reaches far beyond any single verse. If you do not control the language you inherit, then the language you inherit will control the limits of what you think is real. And once that happens, the translation is no longer just describing the world, it is building it. So where does that leave us? Not with a clean verdict. Not with a final proof that Ammon Hillman has exposed a hidden code buried inside the New Testament. And not with a comfortable reassurance that the inherited translations are simply neutral windows into the ancient world. What this leaves us with is something harder. A discipline of reading. A refusal to confuse familiarity with accuracy. A refusal to confuse shock with truth. Hillman may overreach in places. His critics may underreact in others. That is possible, maybe inevitable. But the larger pressure he applies is still valuable. He reminds us that translation is never innocent. Every translation carries a choice. Every choice carries an emphasis. And every emphasis quietly trains the imagination of the reader. That matters, because once a translation becomes traditional, people stop experiencing it as a choice. They experience it as reality. And that is the real issue at the heart of this video. Not whether every radical reading is correct, not whether every institution acted with bad intent, but whether the language we inherited has already been filtered so thoroughly that we no longer notice the filter at all. If that happened, then the most important task is not outrage. It is attention. Closer attention. More disciplined attention. Attention to words, to context, to what a passage can bear and what it cannot. That is the standard we should bring to Hillman. And it is the standard we should bring to the tradition, too. No free pass for the radical reading because it is bold. No free pass for the inherited reading because it is old. The text deserves better than both of those reflexes. Maybe that is the final lesson here. Sometimes the safest interpretation is not the truest one. Sometimes the most explosive interpretation is not the bravest one. And sometimes the only honest thing you can do is remain inside the tension long enough to let the language speak before your loyalties do. So whether you leave this conversation more convinced by Hillman or more skeptical of him, the challenge remains the same. Read more carefully. Trust repetition less. Pay attention when a word arrives already softened. Pay attention when a passage feels too clean. Pay attention when the official version sounds effortless. Because effortless language is often the final product of invisible decisions. And once you start hearing those decisions, you never read the same way again. Maybe that is what makes this debate so unsettling. It is not just about ancient Greek. It is about the discovery that the reality you inherited may have been translated before it was ever explained to you. And if that is true, then the real question is no longer what does the text say? The real question is, who taught you how to hear it?